For centuries, the vast and unforgiving oceans served as a silent graveyard for those daring enough to traverse them. It was not the crashing waves or the thunderous cannons of enemy frigates that sailors feared most, but a creeping, invisible horror. This mysterious affliction would turn robust men into hollow shells, causing their joints to swell and their old scars to inexplicably reopen. Records from the era suggest that between the 16th and 19th centuries, this condition claimed the lives of more than 2 million seafarers. Never before had the human race encountered a predator so relentless, yet so utterly impossible to see with the naked eye. Some historians argue that the age of discovery was almost brought to a standstill by this dietary catastrophe. The story of vitamins begins here, in the damp, cramped quarters of wooden ships, where life was cheap and fresh food was a luxury beyond reach. During this period, the prevailing medical wisdom held that diseases were caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, or foul miasma, in the air. Consequently, when sailors began to succumb to the dreaded scurvy, doctors looked everywhere for a cause except for the one place that mattered the plate. The diet of a typical sailor consisted almost entirely of salted beef hard biscuits and ale, all of which could survive months in the heat of the tropics. While these rations provided the calories necessary for grueling labor, they were completely devoid of the essential nutrients required for the body to repair itself. The physical manifestations of the disease were as gruesome as they were baffling to the observers of the time. Gums would blacken and rot teeth would fall out of their sockets, and a profound lethargy would settle over the entire crew. By the time a ship reached a distant port, it was not uncommon for half the men to have been cast overboard into a watery grave. This staggering loss of life represented a massive economic and military drain on the great empires of Europe. Had the leadership of the Royal Navy recognized the pattern sooner, the course of colonial history might have been fundamentally altered. However, the path to discovery is rarely a straight line, and it required a man of meticulous observation to challenge the status quo. In 1747, a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind decided to conduct what is now considered one of the first controlled clinical trials in medical history. On board the HMS Salisbury, Lind selected 12 patients suffering from scurvy and divided them into 6 pairs. While all the men received the same basic diet, each pair was given a different supplement to see which, if any, would stem the tide of decay. One group received cider, another took drops of sulfuric acid, and others were given seawater or a paste of garlic and mustard. Only the 2 men who were fortunate enough to receive 2 oranges and 1 lemon every day showed a miraculous recovery within a week. One might assume that such a definitive result would have immediately revolutionized naval medicine across the globe. Unfortunately, the truth was far more complicated, as Lind himself struggled to explain why the citrus fruits worked so effectively. In his professional writings, he buried the discovery among dozens of other ineffective theories, failing to highlight the oranges as the sole cure. Furthermore, the high cost of fresh fruit meant that the Admiralty was hesitant to implement his findings on a fleet-wide scale. They were looking for a cheap shelf-stable solution, leading them to experiment with rob a concentrated fruit juice that had been boiled down. Tragically, they did not realize that the boiling process destroyed the very vitamin C that made the fresh fruit so potent. By attempting to make the medicine more convenient, they had inadvertently rendered it useless. Rarely has a scientific breakthrough been so clearly grasped only to be tossed aside due to a lack of chemical understanding. In this chapter of our story, we encounter the phrase "to stem the tide," which describes stopping something bad from increasing. This idiom is frequently used in professional contexts to discuss crisis management and problem-solving strategies. Try incorporating "to stem the tide" into your own vocabulary when describing efforts to halt a negative trend. As the 18th century progressed, the mystery of the invisible killers only deepened as more sailors perished in the pursuit of trade. The conflict between empirical evidence and traditional medical dogma created a lethal stagnation in scientific progress. For decades, the cure for scurvy was treated as a clandestine secret, known only to a few lucky captains, rather than a universal law of health. One such captain was James Cook, whose voyages across the Pacific became legendary for his success in keeping his crew alive. Cook was obsessed with cleanliness and variety in diet, often forcing his men to eat sauerkraut and maltwort under threat of punishment. Although he did not know about vitamins, his rigorous insistence on fresh provisions essentially proved Lynn's theory on a grander stage. If Cook had not been so disciplined, his long-duration voyages of discovery would likely have ended in total disaster. Despite these successes, the medical establishment remained skeptical of the idea that a lack of something could cause disease. For centuries, science had been focused on finding the active cause of illness, such as a poison, a parasite, or a germ. The concept of a deficiency disease was intellectually revolutionary and deeply uncomfortable for the thinkers of the Enlightenment. It suggested that the human body was like a complex machine that required specific tiny components to function, even if they provided no energy. This paradigm shift would not truly take hold until the late 19th century, when the focus shifted from the sea to the rice fields of the East. Even as the Navy finally began issuing lime juice to its sailors, giving rise to the nickname limeys, new problems were emerging elsewhere. In the rapidly industrializing nations, urban populations were beginning to suffer from strange bone deformities and neurological collapses. These people were not at sea, and they often had access to a variety of foods, yet they were dying just as surely as the sailors of old. The struggle for survival was moving from the fringes of the map to the very heart of modern civilization. As we move forward, we will see how a simple bowl of white rice would lead to a discovery that changed medicine forever. In 1890, a Dutch physician in the East Indies would notice something peculiar about the chickens in his laboratory. His observation would finally provide the missing link that James Lind had searched for, but never found. The transition from vague observation to rigorous science was about to begin in a way no one expected. That was the cost of ignorance in a world that was only beginning to understand its own biology. The era of the invisible killers was coming to an end, but the era of the vital amine was just beginning. Within a few years, a single experiment with polished rice would expose a hidden layer of reality. The next chapter of this journey explores how the smallest things can have the biggest impact on our survival. Success in science often depends on noticing the details that everyone else ignores. By the late 19th century, the world believed it had finally unmasked the true source of all human suffering. The pioneering work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch had ushered in the era of germ theory, convincing the medical community that every ailment was caused by a specific microbe. However, in the Dutch East Indies, a devastating disease known as beriberi was baffling scientists and killing thousands of people every year. Patients suffered from extreme weakness, heart failure, and a terrifying paralysis that seemed to spread like wildfire through colonial outposts. If this were indeed a bacterial infection, researchers argued they ought to be able to isolate the culprit in a laboratory setting. Yet despite their most exhaustive efforts, the microscopic killer remained stubbornly elusive, hiding in plain sight within the daily diet of the population. This mystery would eventually lead to a conceptual breakthrough that would shatter the foundations of Victorian medicine. In 1886, a Dutch physician named Christiaan Eijkman was dispatched to Java with a clear mission to find the beriberi germ. Eijkman began his research by injecting laboratory chickens with blood from infected patients, fully expecting them to fall ill. To his surprise, the chickens did indeed develop symptoms similar to beriberi, but so did the control group that had not been injected. He was initially perplexed by this development, wondering if the entire laboratory had somehow become contaminated by an invisible pathogen. Then a sudden change in the bird's health provided a clue that was as unexpected as it was revelatory. The chickens, which had been near death, suddenly and miraculously recovered after a new cook took over the hospital kitchen. Eijkman discovered that the previous cook had been feeding the birds expensive, polished white rice, intended for human patients. The new cook, however, considered it a waste of resources and had reverted to feeding the chickens cheap, unpolished brown rice. This simple shift in animal feed was the catalyst for one of the most significant discoveries in the history of human health. By stripping away the outer husk of the rice to make it look cleaner and more civilized, humans had inadvertently removed a vital life force. Rarely has the pursuit of aesthetic perfection resulted in such a catastrophic biological consequence. Eijkman realized that the poison was not a bacteria, but rather the absence of a specific substance found only in the rice bran. This realization represented a massive departure from the prevailing scientific dogma of the time. At first, Eijkman's colleagues were deeply skeptical, as the idea of a deficiency disease was still considered fringe science. They found it hard to believe that something as insignificant as a grain of rice could hold the power of life and death. Nevertheless, the evidence was becoming too overwhelming to ignore, as more studies confirmed the link between diet and the disease. The culture adapted fast, yet it would take another decade for a brilliant chemist to give this mysterious substance a name. In 1912, a Polish biochemist named Casimir Funk was working in London meticulously analysing the chemical structure of rice bran. He successfully isolated a specific compound that he believed belonged to a class of chemicals known as amines. Because this amine was essential for life, he combined the Latin word vita, meaning life, with amine, to create the term vitamine. Although he would later discover that not all of these substances were actually amines, the name stuck and entered the global lexicon. Funk's visionary paper proposed that scurvy, beriberi, and even rickets were all caused by a lack of these vitamins in the diet. His work finally gave the scientific world a vocabulary to describe the invisible architecture of nutrition. In this section, we encountered the phrasal verb to stumble upon, which means to discover something by chance. Scientists often stumble upon great truths while they are looking for something entirely different. Another useful term is prevailing wisdom, which refers to the ideas that most people believe to be true at a particular time. You can use these expressions when discussing innovation research or historical shifts in thinking. Despite Funk's breakthrough, the battle for scientific acceptance was far from over. The medical establishment demanded rigorous proof and a clear understanding of how these molecules actually functioned inside the human body. This led to a period of intense competition between laboratories in Europe and the United States. Researchers were no longer just looking for cures. They were racing to decode the very chemical alphabet of existence. Had the world remained focused only on germs, millions more would have perished from preventable nutritional gaps. The focus shifted toward the laboratory, where chemists began to realize that vitamin was not just one substance, but a whole family. This transition from observing symptoms to identifying molecules marked the birth of modern nutritional science. It was a time of immense intellectual excitement and profound professional rivalry. Money and prestige were on the line as universities scrambled to claim the next big discovery. The vital amine revolution had officially begun turning the humble kitchen into the front line of medical progress. Innovation survived the pressure of skepticism and emerged stronger. The public began to hear rumors of miracle substances that could prevent blindness and strengthen bones. Food companies saw a golden opportunity to market their products as high-tech health solutions. However, the most difficult part of the journey, the actual isolation of these substances, was still in its infancy. The next challenge would be to move beyond rice and explore the secrets hidden in butter, cod, liver oil, and sunlight. By 1913, researchers in Wisconsin were noticing a strange phenomenon in cows that were fed different types of grain. This observation would lead to the discovery of the very first letter in the vitamin alphabet. That was the spark that ignited a global search for the building blocks of vitality. The era of guessing was over, and the era of precise measurement had arrived. Within a few years, the discovery of vitamin A would prove that Funk's theory was only the tip of the iceberg. For decades, the search for health was a blind race through a dark forest of biological uncertainty. Scientists knew that certain foods prevented disease, but they could not grasp the invisible molecules responsible for the magic. It was as if they were reading a book with missing pages, unable to comprehend the full story of human survival. One popular theory during this time suggested that there might be only one universal vitamin, responsible for all health. However, the reality was far more complex, requiring a decade of discovery to finally reveal the alphabet of life. The breakthrough came in 1913 at the University of Wisconsin, where Elmer McCollum and Marguerite Davis were studying the growth of rats. They discovered that rats fed on lard or olive oil failed to thrive, whereas those given butterfat or cod liver oil grew strong. This led to the identification of fat-soluble A, the very first substance to be formally recognized in the vitamin family. Rarely has a laboratory rat contributed so significantly to the fundamental understanding of human nutrition. If McCollum had not been so meticulous in his observations, the specific role of vitamin A in preventing night blindness might have remained a mystery for years. Soon after, researchers began to realize that the water-soluble factor responsible for curing beriberi was a completely different entity. To avoid confusion, they adopted a simple lettering system, starting with A and B to categorize these life-giving compounds. This naming convention provided a roadmap for future scientists who were now eager to fill in the remaining blanks. Image of the chemical structure of vitamin A. While the letters were being assigned, a tragic epidemic was sweeping through the smog-filled cities of the Industrial Revolution. Children living in cramped, sunless tenements were developing horrific bone deformities, a condition known as rickets. Their legs would bow under the weight of their own bodies, leaving them crippled and stunted for life. For a long time, doctors believed that rickets was an infectious disease caused by the poor hygiene of the urban working class. The conflict between environmental factors and dietary deficiencies created a heated debate in the medical journals of the 1920s. Some researchers observed that cod liver oil seemed to cure the condition, but they couldn't explain why. In a dramatic twist, others found that exposing children to ultraviolet lamps or simple sunlight achieved the same result. How could a dietary nutrient and a beam of light be the same thing? This paradox was finally resolved when it was discovered that sunlight triggers the synthesis of vitamin D within the human skin. This was a revolutionary concept, as it proved that vitamins were not just things we eat, but things our bodies can manufacture under the right conditions. The culture adapted fast to this news, leading to a global craze for sunbathing and the fortification of milk with vitamin D. Never before had a medical discovery so quickly transformed the architecture of our homes and the habits of our daily lives. In this era of exploration, we encounter the phrase "to pave the way," which means to make it easier for something to happen or be built. McCollum's work on vitamin A paved the way for the discovery of almost all subsequent vitamins. Another useful expression is "to shed light on," which means to provide information that makes a difficult subject easier to understand. The discovery of vitamin D shed light on the vital connection between our environment and our internal biology. Try using "pave the way" and "shed light on" when you are describing progress and clarity in your English conversations. As the alphabet grew, the quest for the fabled anti-scurvy factor, now called vitamin C, reached a fever pitch. The man who would finally isolate it was a Hungarian biochemist named Albert Szent-Györgyi, a man known for his wit and unconventional methods. Working at the University of Szeged, he spent years searching for a specific acid that he had found in adrenal glands and citrus juice. He initially called it ignosic acid, jokingly claiming he was ignorant of what it actually was. When his editors refused to publish such a whimsical name, he renamed it hexuronic acid, but he still suspected it was vitamin C. The problem was that he could only extract tiny amounts of the substance from adrenal glands, making it impossible to test on a large scale. The solution came from a local source that was as humble as it was unexpected, the Hungarian paprika. St. Georgia famously told the story of how he didn't want to eat his wife's paprika salad for dinner, so he took it to his lab instead. To his astonishment, he found that the pepper was overflowing with the exact substance he had been hunting for years. Within weeks, he had produced pounds of pure vitamin C, allowing for the definitive proof that it was the cure for scurvy. The story of the paprika salad is a perfect example of how scientific genius often meets a stroke of luck at the dinner table. If he had simply eaten his dinner that night, the isolation of vitamin C might have been delayed by a decade. His monumental achievement was recognized in 1937 when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. By the late 1930s, the alphabet of life was mostly complete, including vitamins K, E, and the complex B family. The focus of science began to shift from finding these substances in nature to reproducing them in the laboratory. The transition from extraction to synthesis would mark the beginning of a multi-billion-dollar industry that we still see today. However, the ability to manufacture health in a factory brought about a new set of ethical and economic challenges. Was a synthetic vitamin truly the same as one found in an orange or a piece of liver? This question would spark a new conflict between the purists of nutrition and the giants of the pharmaceutical world. As we move into the next part, we will explore how World War II accelerated the industrialization of vitamins. The massive demand for healthy soldiers led to the first large-scale fortification of food supplies in history. Soon the simple act of eating would become a calculated chemical process driven by the needs of a nation at war. That was the price of progress in an age that demanded efficiency over tradition. Innovation had moved from the quiet laboratory to the roaring factory floor. The next chapter reveals how the miracle pills were born and how they conquered the kitchen cabinets of the world. Success in the industrial age required turning the mysteries of life into a mass-produced commodity. While the world was consumed by the fires of World War II, a quieter revolution was taking place in the laboratories of the pharmaceutical giants. Governments realized that a malnourished population could not sustain a total war effort, especially when resources were being diverted to the front lines. The survival of nations depended not just on steel and oil, but on the chemical integrity of the food provided to their citizens and soldiers. This urgency forced science and industry into a marriage of convenience that would change the global food supply forever. It was an era where the laboratory bench replaced the garden as the primary source of human health. Some historians argue that the industrialization of vitamins was the final victory of the machine age over the natural world. Records from the 1940s show that the production of synthetic nutrients skyrocketed as countries scrambled to fortify their populations against the stress of conflict. Before the advent of large-scale synthesis, vitamins had to be painstakingly extracted from massive quantities of organic material. To produce just a few grams of vitamin B1, chemists would have had to process hundreds of pounds of rice polishings, making it a prohibitively expensive endeavor. However, the discovery of how to assemble these molecules from scratch in a factory change the economic landscape of health. Chemical companies like Merck and Hoffmann La Roche began to compete for the dominance of the nascent vitamin market. By the mid-1930s, the first synthetic vitamin C was being mass-produced, turning a once rare cure into a cheap, accessible commodity. The ability to synthesize these compounds meant that vitamins could now be added to almost any food product imaginable. Rarely had the human diet been so radically altered in such a short period of time. In 1941, as the United States prepared for entry into the war, the government convened the National Nutrition Conference for Defense. The experts were alarmed by the hidden hunger affecting millions of Americans who had enough calories but were deficient in key nutrients. They decided that the most efficient way to solve the problem was to mandate the enrichment of white flour and bread. Consequently, niacin-thiamine and riboflavin were added back into the grains that had been stripped of their natural goodness. This move was a massive success, leading to the near-total eradication of diseases like pellagra and beriberi in the Western world. Had the government not intervened with these mandates, the public health of the post-war generation would have looked significantly different. Despite the obvious benefits, this process also signaled a profound shift in how we perceive the act of eating. Food was increasingly seen as a delivery system for chemicals rather than a complex web of cultural and biological traditions. The conflict between whole foods and fortified products began to take root in the minds of the more skeptical consumers. Yet for the majority of the population, the convenience and safety of vitamin-packed bread were far too appealing to ignore. Innovation survived the transition from wartime necessity to peacetime prosperity. As the war ended, the vitamin industry did not scale back its operations. Instead, it ramped up its marketing efforts toward the growing middle class. They were no longer selling a cure for a specific disease. They were selling a vision of optimal health and vitality. This represents a classic example of a market expansion, where a product transitions from a medical necessity to a lifestyle choice. In this chapter, we encounter the phrasal verb to ramp up, which means to increase something significantly in amount or intensity. Another important term is to take root, describing an idea or habit that becomes established and difficult to change. These phrases are excellent for describing business growth and social trends in advanced English. Try using ramp up when discussing a project at work, or take root when talking about a new cultural movement. By the 1950s, the one-a-day multivitamin pill had become a staple of the American breakfast table. This little tablet promised to bridge the gap between a modern busy lifestyle and the biological requirements of the body. It was a powerful psychological tool that offered peace of mind in a single, easy-to-swallow package. Nevertheless, some scientists began to wonder if we were becoming overly reliant on these chemical shortcuts. If a person eats a poor diet and takes a pill, are they truly as healthy as someone who eats balanced natural meals? The industry brushed these concerns aside, focusing instead on the scientific prestige of their massive production facilities. Never before had humanity been so confident in its ability to master the microscopic building blocks of life. The transition from discovery to manufacturing was now complete, setting the stage for the next great revolution. It was a time of immense economic growth for the pharmaceutical sector, which saw its profits soar to unprecedented heights. The culture adapted fast, and soon the labels of every cereal box were covered in lists of percentages and chemical names. That was the cost of a world that valued efficiency and standardization above all else. The era of synthetic dominance had arrived, but it would soon be challenged by a new wave of celebrity science. In the 1970s, a man with 2 Nobel Prizes would spark a controversy that still divides the medical world today. He would claim that vitamins weren't just for preventing disease, they were the secret to eternal youth and the cure for the common cold. The next chapter explores the rise of the supplement superpower and the man who started it all. Success in the modern age often depends on the ability to turn a scientific theory into a global obsession. Open loops are closing, but the biggest debate in nutrition is only just beginning. The gap between what we need and what we want was about to widen dramatically. Imagine a world where a single pill is marketed as the ultimate defense against aging cancer and the common cold. By the 1970s, the humble vitamin had transcended its role as a mere nutrient to become a symbol of personal empowerment and longevity. Many historians point to one specific individual as the primary catalyst for this unprecedented cultural and economic shift. This man was not a slick marketing executive, but a scientist of extraordinary prestige who held 2 unshared Nobel Prizes. His vocal advocacy would spark a multi-billion-dollar industry that continues to dominate the global health landscape today. Whether his theories were visionary or fundamentally flawed remains a subject of intense debate in modern medical circles. The story of the supplement superpower begins with the legendary chemist Linus Pauling and his obsession with vitamin C. In 1970, Pauling published a book titled Vitamin C and the Common Cold, which urged Americans to take doses far higher than the recommended daily allowance. He claimed that high-dose megadosing could not only prevent respiratory infections, but also extend the human lifespan by decades. Never before had a scientist of such high standing made such bold, sweeping claims directly to the general public. The effect was instantaneous, as drugstores across the nation found themselves unable to keep up with the surging demand for ascorbic acid. Pauling's message resonated deeply with the generation that was beginning to question traditional authority and seek natural alternatives to industrial medicine. If Pauling had been a lesser scientist, his ideas might have been dismissed as mere eccentricity or pseudoscience. However, his impeccable credentials made it difficult for the medical establishment to ignore his provocative suggestions. Despite numerous clinical trials failing to replicate his miraculous results, the public's belief in the power of the pill continued to grow. This represents a fascinating moment where the narrative of health moved from the laboratory to the realm of cultural mythology. The conflict between evidence-based medicine and personal testimony created a massive rift in the scientific community. As the 1980s progressed, the industry expanded beyond simple vitamins to include minerals, herbs, and exotic extracts. The marketing changed its focus, moving from the prevention of rare diseases like scurvy to the promise of optimal wellness. Rarely has a consumer product successfully tapped into the human fear of mortality so effectively. By the early 1990s, the supplement industry in the United States faced a major threat from the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA wanted to regulate supplements more strictly, treating them almost like pharmaceutical drugs that required proof of safety and efficacy. In response, the industry launched a massive grassroots lobbying campaign portraying the government as a tyrant trying to take away health freedom. This led to the passage of the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, or DSHEA, in 1994. This law was a monumental victory for the industry as it essentially deregulated supplements and shifted the burden of proof to the government. From that moment on, companies could sell almost anything as long as they didn't claim it cured a specific named disease. Innovation survived the regulatory battle, but it often shifted from chemical research to creative labeling and clever marketing. In this final chapter, we heard the word transcend, which means to go beyond the usual limits of something. We also encountered advocacy, which refers to public support for a particular cause or policy. These terms are very useful when discussing social movements, legal battles, or career achievements in advanced English. Try to use transcend when describing something that breaks boundaries and advocacy when talking about supporting a change. Today, the global supplement market is worth over $150 billion, fueled by an aging population and a relentless desire for a quick fix. The transition from essential nutrient to lifestyle accessory is now complete in most developed nations. We find ourselves in a strange paradox where we have more access to nutrition than any generation in history, yet we are more obsessed with pills than ever. Had we focused more on the quality of our whole food systems, the need for such a massive supplement industry might have been diminished. Nevertheless, the convenience of the capsule remains an irresistible lure for the modern time poor individual. The culture adapted fast to the idea that health can be bought in a bottle and consumed in seconds. Scientific skepticism continues to challenge the megadose theory, pointing out that excess vitamins are often simply excreted by the body. Yet the psychological comfort provided by these products seems to outweigh the lack of rigorous clinical evidence for many. The story of vitamins is ultimately a story of human ingenuity, curiosity, and the desire to master our own biology. It is a journey that took us from the rotting gums of 18th century sailors to the high-tech laboratories of the 21st century. We have moved from the fear of invisible killers to the hope of invisible healers. That was the evolution of a concept that changed the way we perceive life itself. The era of discovery may be over, but the era of optimization is just beginning to unfold. As we look to the future, the boundary between food and medicine will likely continue to blur even further. Technological advancements may soon allow for personalized nutrition based on our individual genetic codes. One thing is certain, our fascination with these tiny life-giving molecules is far from exhausted. Success in the future will require a balance between the wonders of synthetic science and the wisdom of natural complexity. The history of vitamins reminds us that even the smallest things can redefine the world. We are still learning how to nourish the potential that lies within every human cell. Knowledge is the most essential nutrient of all.